Ladies and gentlemen, I am Corion, your witch in residence here on YouTube. And today I've got another author spotlight. I'm super happy to be discussing the life and times of Stephen Pearl. His new book, Lycanthrope, is going to be out in 2 weeks. And we are going to be talking about everything from his inspirations to how his spirituality affects his writing, to some of the fantastic parts of working with someone who really enjoys the speculative fiction aspect of writing. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen B. Pearl. Stephen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you.
Oh,
and hello to everybody.
Excellent. So I've gotten a chance to read a few of your books, and I gotta say, it's really impressive, some of the work you've done.
Thank you.
I particularly like that you've gone with a lot of very nuanced and pagan characters, but also characters that would be very relatable to non-pagans as well. And it feels like your writing style is very organic and more along the lines of, I'm sitting down with somebody who's telling me this story around a campfire. And it's fantastic that way.
Yeah, I am for that. I'm what they call a pantser. Okay. And I don't know if you're familiar, but there are two different types of writers. Planners, who mark everything out on a sheet of paper and have arcs and so forth. And pantsers, who basically sit down at the computer and make it up as they go along.
Fly by the seat of your pants kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And neither way is right. And neither way is better than the other. You just have to work as to your own style.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's about right for you, not necessarily right for, the craft of writing.
Yeah. And the way that I work is I establish my world, very detailed. Then I will populate it with characters who have the skill set necessary to accomplish what I want them to accomplish. And then I just sit down and let the story tell itself.
That's amazing. So when writing your work, I mean, obviously most of your books have had very pagan leaning, shall we say, with characters inspired along the lines of Kemetic or Egyptian following pagans, to even in the Lycanthrope series, we've had characters that are very, very heavily pagan influenced. And in fact, we even had a book where, you had a Christian cult going after some of your characters. And yeah, and I was wondering, what, obviously, you yourself are following a pagan path.
Yes.
What made you gravitate towards telling those stories from a self-informed perspective?
Well, a lot of it came down that there is so much negative propaganda out there, from the old Christian texts through Hollywood, through a lot of the horror, where, the witch is the bad guy, look the Grimm's fairy tales, we eat children, blah, blah, blah. And my feeling is fiction is a tool that can be used very effectively to counter that, because fiction is largely where it came from. So somebody reads my book, they're getting entertained, number one. But in the absence of actual research, of somebody going in and looking up things in nonfiction texts, people are informed by the fiction they read. And as such, if I can educate, then I've done something. I've done something of value to my community. And I will rush to say, the first function of fiction is always to entertain. If fiction fails to entertain, it has failed as fiction. So you have to avoid being preachy. Any education and so forth has to be slipped in organically and as a natural result of what's going on in the fiction. Like the characterization in my Chronicles of Ray McAndrews. Ray just happens to be a very pagan. He's a pagan Egyptian path pagan wizard priest, very eclectic as well.
Right.
That is just the backdrop of the character. Then you get on with this guy who's just hyper moral and feels that he has a obligation to defend his fellow man, and has the tools to do it. And that's how I try to educate people, by demonstrating that, yes, this higher value is there, this moral essence.
Right.
So,
in a lot of ways, by, generating fiction that teaches, do you feel that kind of, I guess, kinship to, like, the classical bard archetype, telling the community stories by the fire, and in doing so, like, teaching kind of moral lessons along with the fairy tale, if you will?
Very much so. I find one of the saddest things about modern entertainment media is that they have supplanted the bard without taking on the obligations of the bard. And when I find one of the things that I really love, I saw a cartoon just recently, and it was a fictionalization of the first female firefighters in New York.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and I was flipping by, and I clicked on this, and I started watching. And there were these moments in it that were absolutely beautiful. And one of the things that they were saying, the experienced firefighter, the fire captain, was telling the novice, who happened to be his daughter in disguise, but anyways, was telling them, don't run, walk with purpose. And the whole message was, yes, you're in a fire, you never run, because you have to stop and consider your actions. Think of the consequences of your actions and how they're going to pan out, and then act.
Yeah.
And I was a lifeguard for a very long time, and that's one of the hardest things to learn in an emergency situation, to take that split second, because all of the training is hurry up, do it. You have to take that split second to consider the consequences and see what's going on before you act. And it was just resplendent with little things like that. And that's what I try to do with my writing, of drop these little things in along the way and explore what these little things are. And well,
yeah, it's I think pausing and assessing in the moment is a skill that, we're starting to lose almost, and it's so vital. How often has a problem been solved by just stopping and re-examining the problem from a different direction? Which, incidentally, I do see your characters do a lot in your fiction as well. When they're hit with something critical, they stop, and you can read their thought process of how they're deciding where and how to act. And it's a fantastic way to write.
Yeah, well, it's it allows you to get to know the character. And again, it goes back to that teaching thing, because I've met so many people who don't know how to make a decision. And it drives me, because it's a very simple process. Frank Herbert taught it to me.
Yep.
Through Dune.
Yep.
The Mentat decision-making process. And I've kind of internalized that, and I put it into my characters. And you have this huge variety of options, and you look at what your needs are. Well, anything that doesn't fulfill those needs, immediately it's off the table, and then you don't revisit it.
Yep.
Then, what's going to fulfill the need with the least consequence? And you just pare it down like that until you decide on your course of action.
Yeah.
I've met people who, instead of discarding the non-viable options, they keep them on the table the entire time, and they can't make up their minds.
Yeah, it leads to that kind of analysis paralysis moment
Yeah.
where there's just too much on the table, and they can't filter out what's critical and what isn't. And this is one of the pieces that I think a lot of people don't realize about fictional writing these days, is that it's almost absolutely critical that our characters are not just, going through the motions and just kind of surviving the day, if you will, but that they're making decisions, and we need to understand that process so that when we are faced with hopefully not nearly as high stakes situations, we can emulate that logic.
Yeah, and I also, nobody wants to read ineffectuality.
Right?
I like empowered characters. They may not be, super powered. No, that's boring. I mean, Batman is far more interesting than Superman because Batman is just a man. He doesn't have this huge, powerful skill set, and he has to use his brains.
Yeah, I believe the way Robert Heinlein actually described it was the competent man characters, where they're not necessarily really good at one thing, but they have a breadth of knowledge that they can take advantage of. And if they can't relate to something that they've previously experienced, they can use what they have experienced to extrapolate what the most logical next steps would be.
Yeah, that is the epitome, actually, of one of my pagan-friendly series, the Tinker's World series, Tinker's Plague and Tinker's Sea, where it's a very competent man-woman.
Yeah.
And they're being thrown on over their, out of their depth. But they cope because they are extrapolating and building on what they already know.
And those are life skills for the long term too. They're techniques and classical behavior that, are important pieces that I think in a lot of classical religion training are made very, very clear that no, this is a critical piece of that training, is sitting down and being able to extrapolate what you've learned and apply it to situations where you might be in over your depth, right? I mean, chances are none of you in the audience there are going to be having direct dealings with the Fae, but you've read enough stories to go, I have an idea of how I should behave here, right?
Yes. Wear your clothes inside out, carry a piece of iron.
Yeah, right. Although I do love how Jim Butcher refers to iron when dealing with the Fae as it's like you're walking around with a pound of uranium to deal with a problem. Right?
Yeah, that is a good one.
Yeah, I mean it's fantastic. So, in your story, your story in Dreaming the Goddess Family Business, it seemed to make light of wearing hearts. What was that all about?
Okay, the weighing of hearts, of course, this big thing, you are being judged, and if you fail the judgment, a mutt will devour your heart. and you don't get to go into the fields of reeds and that pet and sit back and kick back and let your shanty figures do all the work while you reap all the benefits. And that's a pretty frightening thing. But I also have a bit of a part of my philosophy of life is if you can't laugh at it, you're taking it too seriously.
Right.
So there they are in the judgment, and this poor guy is sort of, oh no, I haven't lived a perfect life, and my heart is going to get eaten, and I'm going to be nullified, and I'm just going to get tossed back with my memories blanked, and I'm going to have to go through another incarnation, and blah, blah, blah. So they're weighing his heart, and of course the heart is heavy on the scale. And then Lady Bast enters the room, throws open the door, and all the cats that he's had throughout his life, including the strays who he's fed, and a family of raccoons who he helped through the winter. And I think I even have a skunk in there, I'm not sure. It's been a while since I wrote it. But they charge into the Hall of Judgment, and they do what cats do. And you have a whole bunch of them hanging off the scale, pulling it down so his heart's going up. And you have another one who's gone into the plant pots beside Lord Osiris. And he's scratting around and squatting, and Osiris is sitting there going, cats, what are you going to do?
Right.
And, but it's the idea of people misunderstand the weighing of the hearts, for one thing. They think that your heart is supposed to be light against the feather of Mat. No, it's supposed to be in balance with the feather of Mat. Because the feather of Mat represents natural law. And you have not done a great deal more damage than you've done good. You have lived according to the code, basically, be it that thou harm none, do what thou wilt, the reed.
Yeah.
But you have lived up to this, and you are in balance. And it takes the totality of your life. And the way that I view it is that the heart is actually, it's not the emotional essence of who you are, because that is what reincarnates. We're like zip files.
Right.
In my view, when we die, it's like zipping a file, and you lose all the keystroke record, but you keep the essence of the work that was done. And that's what reincarnates. And that essence is your compassion, your concern, basically your emotional gestalt.
Yeah.
So you have basically the gods agreeing that, all right, yeah, this guy has screwed up a bit, but we're really short-staffed. Because another aspect of my own personal belief system is that you have the gods who are the netters, I'll use the Egyptian term, and they're administrators of the natural rays of the universe. And there's probably only about 10 of them. But they all have a staff.
Yeah.
And they all give different business cards to different people. So, you have Horus, Balder, Apollo. Same guy, different business cards.
Yeah.
And they all have a staff, and this guy gets indoctrinated into the staff of Lady Bast and is doing nice things for cats and people and keeping his memories.
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of looked at it kind of from an odd perspective, that I think it's other creators that the creators want around them. Because let's be honest, you've created this place, and I don't know about you, but it's always like, it always seems like authors want to hang around with other authors to discuss authory things.
Hmm.
So I almost feel like the gods may want to hang around with creators of a similar vein, just so that they can shop talk at the very least.
You can have an intelligent conversation.
Right, like you somebody will understand this. Like, for example, in an Apollo case, right? Like, I could totally see him wanting other musicians around just so he can have a decent jam session, right?
Yeah.
For the Norse pantheon, which I'm pretty familiar with on my side. There's a reason why Odin would want some of the best warriors around to hang out with. And part of it is probably because, he does kind of want to talk shop. He does want people that'll understand him around, just so that they have a mutual understanding they can build on and be like, hey, did you see what that smith was doing? Like, that's kind of unique. What do you think of it? How would you use it, kind of thing?
Hmm.
And, those conversations, I feel like, would be an interesting thing to just get a little peek at every once in a while, right? Like, if only we could see those conversations happen where, like, Hephaestus is talking auto shop with a bunch of car mechanics, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I tend to concur. I mean, well, the concept like attracts like,
Right.
and I think that a great deal of where we are drawn spiritually is that we are finding places that we echo and that echo us, and I try to hit a bit of that in the books. I mean, with the Chronicles of Ray McAndrews, I have Ray and I have Kathy, who are the primary couple in it.
Yeah.
And they are both Egyptian path mystics.
Mm-hmm.
Either one alone is quite formidable. Together, they're hell on wheels.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that Egyptian Kemetic path, what drew you to it?
Well, it was a long time ago, but I had been meditating for a couple of years, and I had been studying, just generally, a lot of Wicca, a little bit of, a lot of Wicca, a lot of mythology, a little bit of just general magical practices. And I was meditating. And I felt someone tap me on the shoulder. I looked around, and I saw this incredibly impressive, hawk-headed gentleman with a solar disc on his head. And I went, oh. I thought, oh. And he said, "You're mine." And I said, okay, what should I do? Read. Anything else? Crickets chirping. And at that point, I wasn't going to argue.
Right?
So I started studying. I kept studying eclectically, but I focused on Egypt, and I was guided to books that filled in what I needed to know. And I've never been a big joiner, and there weren't really that many kinetic groups in my area. And by the way, in my opinion, Kemetic is what you say when you're trying to put on the dog, and Egyptian is what you say when you want people to know what the hell you're talking about.
Right, exactly. That's why I'm kind of trying to use both terms for my audience here, so that we can build that association for them, right? Because we use, And it's interesting because, we use things like Norse path for
Mhm.
Viking religion. We use Hellenistic or Odyssean for like a Greek or Greco-Roman path, and Kemetic for an Egyptian path. But what I think is important for people to understand, at least from a historical context, is these are terms we're using in modern day, because
Mhm.
back then they just would have called it like their family's religion, right?
Yep.
Or their people's faith, right? It never would have occurred to them to necessarily give it a formal name, because the chances of dealing with outsiders who didn't at least have a passing understanding of your pantheon was so rare a situation that you
Mhm.
wouldn't really need to name it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also, if you want to really look at Egyptian, there is not a consistent Egyptian mythology.
True.
Every city-state had its own, and as they intermingled, they swapped god names, but they didn't really swap myths that much. So you have completely contradictory creation stories at one end of the Nile and the other end of the Nile.
Yeah.
But they all got along. And it was a thing of, okay, you emphasize Ra, I emphasize Horus, I emphasize Ptah. Big deal.
Right.
Let's get the brain in.
Yeah, and it's an interesting study of mythology. I've spent a lot of time studying it and trying to read it in original language terms.
Mm-hmm.
Going as far back as we can. I'm actually super excited right now because they found just recently more of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was actually within this last year. So, just putting it out there, we got more Epic of Gilgamesh before we got more Game of Thrones. Just saying. Right? But this is the key, is sitting down and realizing that, bits of it come from various places throughout that part of the world, and some of it doesn't necessarily add up because they wouldn't have necessarily had those contacts, right? We live in a world now where we've had the internet for what now? Going on almost 35 years. A lot of people don't remember a world without the internet and being able to access information from everywhere and getting, for lack of a better term, their story straight now. And being able to kind of look at that time capsule of a time when, your network of information, existed maybe a couple of miles outside of your village. And yet, occasionally you get these travelers that would tell you tales from their world, from their part of the globe. And they would fascinate you, and you'd adapt it into your own pieces.
Yeah. Well, an interesting sort of side to that. Terry Pratchett, in one of his books, I'm not sure which it was now, what had Death speaking, and he was saying, there have always been apocalypses, and the apocalypse would happen, the river would flood, the city would be destroyed, but always they would go over the next hill and there would be the other civilization. And they hadn't been over that hill before because there was no need to go over that hill before. And I think that is very, very telling and a very interesting way of understanding how isolated we traditionally were. The majority of people never traveled more than the next village over, and a lot of them never traveled that far.
Right.
And it's, I've been halfway around the globe, and even 100 years ago, that would not have happened.
No, it would have been almost impossible, right? I mean, we're just now getting to the point where, we're starting to get very close to, we're beyond, I think, 100 years since World War I. But even then, they were going from, like the longest trips would have been from like the San Francisco far, west coast style of the United States to Europe, right? Now people do that daily practically. But
Hmm.
in that time, it was a month or two journey by boat, even.
Yep.
And getting home was even a challenge because if you didn't make the right boat, you could wind up in North America, but not necessarily anywhere close enough to be able to get a train that would take you the rest of the way.
Yeah. I mean, the world has gotten progressively smaller. And I did actually, in my Freedom Saga, another one of the ones that are, well, yeah, I guess I can call it pagan friendly because I actually built a quasi pagan religion for it.
Right.
But in that, I have the only method of space travel, faster than light travel, is stargates, point to point wormholes, basically. And they have to have their ends anchored on the outer edge of a solar system so that the gravity from the sun does not disrupt them.
Right.
So it takes 2 to 3 weeks to reach the Stargate from the Goldilocks zone. You go through, and then it's 2 to 3 weeks to get to the switchboard station because they put one end of these point-to-point transfer stations all around this one star. And the switchboard station is the central hub of the Galactic Republic. Then it's 2 to 3 weeks from the switchboard station to the next Stargate through, then 2 to 3 weeks back into the Goldilocks zone. So, this, you're looking at least a couple of months to go anywhere.
Right. You've got that hurry up and wait kind of piece to it.
Yeah. And the big thing is, how do you not go completely stir crazy sitting on on these ships while you're doing these transfers?
Yeah.
But so it takes it back to that 1700, 1600 sort of travel mentality.
Right.
But it's interesting that you can do that in science fiction and do it so it has a good rationale for why it is that way.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of the BattleTech universe, where their ships instantaneously move from one point in the galaxy to another, but the energy cost is so high and they don't have energy generation technology sufficient to power quickly. So they actually have to use basically large solar panel sails and sit at like the zenith or the nadir of a star system and just sit there recharging and send little ships into the system and out. And there's a lot of, in that fiction, the hurry up and wait, the, since we're sitting here, let's get into the simulators and train and practice because we don't have anything else to do. And it actually gets rather amusing because in times in the fiction, they make comments that, keeping these combatants in these sort of positions for long periods of time, some of the factions think is great because by the time they get to a planet, they're already pretty punchy and ready and are spoiling for a fight with somebody, and the enemy just happens to be there. So go for it, guys.
Yeah, again, that's another aspect of good writing. The psychology of your characters. And people are people. It doesn't matter. People are still going to be people 1,000 years from now. People were people 5,000 years in the past. I mean, I think it's really interesting. The first record of a labor dispute in history was during the building of the Great Pyramid.
Yep.
Because they were supposed to get X amount of beer and X number of cabbages per day that they worked, and middle management was swindling them and holding back on the beers and cabbages. And they went on strike and refused to work, and the upper management came down and said, hold on, you're right. You're not getting the right number of beers and cabbages. And middle management found themselves basically sold into slavery.
Yep.
New guys were appointed. And after that, they got the right number of beers and cabbages. So,
yeah, it kind of makes you wonder why we got rid of flogging our leaders when they screw us up as a society, right?
yeah, well, the leaders didn't like it.
Yeah, I suppose that's the problem.
Yeah.
So,
I believe in more responsibility in that way.
Well, I mean, I've always believed that you honor the agreements that you've made. And,
yeah.
I've always found, because I've worked in IT as the low level, and I've worked my way up into middle management, and I've always found that the best way to get the best from my people is not through the stick, but through the carrot, and believing in them, right?
Yeah.
Because if you can say to them, like, no, look, this situation, the judgment call may have been bad, but you have good judgment most of the time. It's just we need to correct it for next time and move on. No big deal, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like when you acknowledge a person in that environment as a person, and as a person that 99% of the time you can trust them to do good work, they're going to work harder for you.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to believe in the work more if they have the right support. And, I can't see that being any different from the past either, right? I mean, I always laugh about the pyramids, saying that this is, the single largest public works project and potentially make busy project that has ever existed in mankind's history.
Mm-hmm. But the other thing is, because of the Egyptian system, the Egyptians had the tithing of the third.
Yeah.
Basically, their tax was 1/3 of everything that you produce. But there was a social aid project in this that you could be excused your tithing if during the flood period you did labor for Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And this was a way that the poor people in society were excused having to surrender 1/3 of their makings to the government.
Yeah.
And it got the temples built, it got the pyramids built, got the palaces built. And I'm asking the question, right now, our governments are taking over 60% of our total earnings and incomes. What have they forgotten that we knew then?
That's it.
I mean, how corrupt and inefficient we must be in comparison.
Well, I think, and this is one of the things that I've noticed in your writing too, is that there's almost a concept of when you deal with the divine, of like a divine bureaucracy,
Mm-hmm.
right? That it becomes somebody's almost gift of service to humanity and the divine to just do a good middle management style job. And I think that's an important piece in society overall, is we've lost the concept of taking pride in one's work by being a professional throughout.
Yeah, well, I lifted the concept of the divine bureaucracy from a combination of mythology, because it's always organized like a family.
Right.
And Confucianism. Because Confucianism has that very much divine bureaucracy as its structure.
Right.
And yeah, I think to an extent we do fall into that. And we always fall into the family pattern, no matter what. We can't help it. So I like to put that into my books, because it helps people Orient. And you get a lot of that with Ray McAndrews.
Yes.
I think it was in Nuki Kubai that I had him discussing archetypes and how basically you're you associate with a particular archetype to be able to tap into its energy and draw it forward, and it's more like begging a gift from a superior. But again, these things get a little blurry because I wrote Nuki Kubai. Oh, it must be 15 years ago now.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was very pleasantly surprised when I started doing my research, is just the breadth of novels that you've put out. I'm gonna put links to as many as are out there right now in the description, guys. I really do recommend checking out his work. But the key to it is too, I guess this is my piece. I write routinely, but the breadth of stories that you tell, and the ones that have just been kind of rattling around in there, where do you get the inspiration to, okay, I've made this story as complete as I want to, now let's move on to the next one? What is beyond that next hill? What civilization do I run into next? What inspires you to start the next story?
Well, as I said, I always start with my world, and I'll be playing around with the world, and the characters will start to come up. And eventually, one of the characters will grab me by the scruff of the neck and say, write me now. So I'll start writing. And lately, the last few years, I've been doing the Freedom Saga because it got hold, and I'm working on book 9 of it right now, and there will be a book 10, but not for a while because it's gotten to the point where those characters are sated.
Right.
And in that time, I also wrote Lycanthrope.
Right.
Actually, I wrote Revenant and Lycanthrope because when I wrote Revenant, at the end of Revenant, Ray and Kathy are really not in a good place.
Yeah.
And I couldn't leave them there. Just something inside me rebelled against leaving them there. So I wrote Lycanthrope, and it brought the initial Ray-Kathy relationship saga to the next point in the spiral. Because they start here in a good place, they go into kind of a bad place, and then they come back to more or less the same good place, but at a higher level.
Yeah.
And the next book is in that series, in the Chronicles of Ray Andrews, will be Kitsu, the foxwomen of Egyptian mythology.
Yeah.
And in the first book, you have Kuno, who is the young the young Japanese.
Right. This is
mythology.
Yeah.
Well, he goes back to Japan at the end of the first book to continue hunting the Nuki Kubai there. And through him, they call Ray in for a variety of reasons. And it's going to happen mostly in Japan.
So when you're writing something like an adventure in Japan, how do you assemble or design your research for that? What do you have, like a process where you go, okay, I got to go beyond just Wikipedia here. I got to get deeper into that knowledge base. Like, what does that look like in your process?
A lot of Google Maps with satellite feed and street feed. Um, it's going to be a very challenging ride because it's a real place, and I want to do that justice. It's the mythology. I've already done that multiple times. It's fairly easy. Just read the myths, digest them, see what the commonality of the various myths are, and then extrapolate from that. And things don't necessarily have to be as the myths have put it, because Kitsu were mischief makers.
Right.
They're not actually malignant.
No, that kind of archetype of the trickster deity. A lot of people think that it's about just screwing with people, and it's not. It's teaching through misadventure, for lack of a better term. Right?
Yeah, well, the only problem with the trickster deity is the tendency for mischief and a touch of chaos to become social evil.
Right.
If you look at Loki, many of the positive things that the Asgardians have come directly from Loki.
Absolutely.
But he carries it too far. And also, if you look at it, Odin was not particularly kind to Loki on many occasions, especially to his children.
True.
So, you can get into a whole debate, without getting too metaphysical about it, but you can get into a whole debate about the mythology involving Odin. Was Odin himself a cautionary tale about over-reliance on divination?
Exactly. I actually like explaining that relationship between Loki and Odin and what have you through Star Trek: The Next Generation, actually. Mm-hmm. Because I think Q is the perfect quintessential trickster deity. Yeah. And Picard is always the straight edge Odin that's had enough of Q's nonsense. And yet, every time he shows up, he's teaching. And he's giving some advantage in one way or another to the Enterprise without them necessarily realizing it.
And you had, it's stated right in the canon that Q intervened with the Q to give humanity a chance, because the Q were ready to annihilate humanity. Yeah. And Q, the great trickster who has been vilified throughout the entire series, actually stepped up and said, no, they deserve a chance. Yeah. It's interesting. I always found, I find a lot, it's reflective of society, but I find a lot of the Next Generation to be a little too human-centric.
Right.
I mean, you look at a being like the Q. He's the human in the house full of hamsters.
Right.
And the hamsters are all running around. And the fact that he may not be gentle when he pulls the hamster out of the breakfast cereal and tosses them across the room. Well, given the fact that he could just step on all the hamsters and crush them in an instant, it would be no big deal.
Yep.
That's pretty benign. Everything is relative to your power level.
Right. And, it's also that, but I think that's what gets lost, is that aspect of teaching through mischief making, right?
Yeah.
And I think I think that's one of the things that I love about the classical myths is you see character archetypes that are almost universal throughout the various parts of the world
Mhm.
that are trying to teach almost similar lessons, because everybody did need to learn those as humans, right? We all needed to learn that, hey, you play with fire, you're going to get burned, right?
Mhm.
Or that things will get bad, but then they get okay again. And it's important to prepare for the bad times during the okay times so that you're ready for it, right? And that, certain people are going to have it rough, but then they're going to get through it. And they're going to become forever changed by that. And sometimes it can be in good ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the Hollow Curse, I kind of do that as an exploration of, well, the old saying, if you seek vengeance, start by digging two graves.
Yep.
And I very much have it that in the Hollow Curse, the one who is the originator of the curse, you see her or him, depending on the incarnation, suffering time and time again because they are holding to the anger and sense of betrayal and sense of entitlement that were the real origins of the curse. And my protagonists are more or less being dragged along, dealing with their own issues. But what it is the curse is basically exacerbating their issues. And that's its power. That these issues that they might otherwise put aside get magnified so that they don't necessarily deal with them until, well, I'm not going to give away the end of the book.
Well, I guess we'll just have to buy it then, won't we? Right?
Yeah. Well, a very racy love story.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Definitely one you don't necessarily want to read as a kid's bedtime story, shall we say?
No. 18 plus, NT 17.
Yeah. But well, I was gonna say, but it's important to appeal to a wider audience too, right? And having a little bit of the I guess more, how should I put it, romantic stories out there is also important, because you never know what's going to resonate with somebody.
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually, with the Hollow Curse and with Worlds Apart, as well, I would love it if couples read it to each other, trading off a chapter, because I think that would draw couples more together. There's the action adventure aspect, there's the romance aspect, there's the naughty bits. There's really good stuff there that I think would draw couples together. And one of the things my wife and I did for a number of years was read books to each other. Not necessarily erotic books,
right?
But things. The Weird Stone of Berzingerman was one of the ones that we read. By the way, one of the best children's books ever written. Adults can enjoy it too.
Some of the best fiction is written that way, where it's simple enough for children to pick up and get lost in the adventure, but adults are going to stay and realize the deeper messaging and meaning behind pieces, and still be in awe of how it was put together.
Yeah, there's. I really like that kind of way, and I think I occasionally aspire into that. I tend to be very straightforward, but
I think you've done a pretty good job of it so far, given what I've been able to read. You've got a style of writing that would appeal to a wide audience, with characters I don't think they will have seen before.
Well, that's very true, especially the Bastard Prince saga, Horn of the
Yes.
Kraken, and Mistletoe Spear.
Yes.
I actually had a review. I can't remember the reviewer's name off the top of my head, but she basically said there was something for everybody. You know, there was something for people who want a role-playing type adventure. There were stuff for people who were into heathenism.
Yep.
People who just wanted a rock-rolling adventure. And I was very taken with that review because that's exactly what I was aiming for. I wanted to cross those borders.
It's always kind of awesome when somebody like clicks when they read it, where they've got it, and you can see that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also got to be, I would imagine, a little frustrating when you're going through a review and somebody got something from your stories that you totally did not intend, and you're like, wait a minute, no, there was this other thing here that you kind of missed, and that's why you didn't get the whole piece, right?
There was one review I had. Most of my reviews are really positive, and hey, you're saying nice things about me. What's not to love? There was this one, and I read the review, and I just shook my head and said, "Did you even read the book?" Because they were so off base on things. Like, I don't know whether they were on pain medication when they wrote it. Oh, excuse me. But it was just... I was shaking my head. But, you know, you're not always going to get good reviews.
That's
so you read them, and if there's something of value, it's sort of, okay, you've helped me become a better writer. Fine. But I read this, and it was just sort of, whose book did you read? So I discounted it.
And that's fair, right? I mean, I think the positive reviews are just as valuable as the negative reviews, right?
Oh, yeah.
Provided the negative reviews give constructive criticism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's how we get better, right? Is with feedback from others. Jim Butcher famously has a group of internet nerds that he turns to whenever he's writing a book, and has them read the book and give him feedback on chapter by chapter as he's writing it, so that, you know, he's not just in his own head writing it. He's got the feedback to be able to say, oh yeah, you know, I guess that does make sense that this isn't resonating, or this other piece is just too cruel to my protagonist. I'm going to double down on that, right? I mean...
Yeah, well, well, I will say, as much as I love the Harry Dresden books, he did for a while carry it just a little too far with making Harry miserable.
Yes.
And I think in the last two were horrendous. He's sort of backed off on that.
Yeah, I'm... It's going to be interesting to see where he goes with it.
Yeah.
But, you know, not to spoil it for anyone, but, you know, I feel like it's definitely an interesting style of writing where you start from the place of my main character must suffer, right? It makes me wonder about the writers of Deep Space Nine and their fascination with making Miles O'Brien suffer. Right? You know, like what ticks to do that, right? Why do you decide I'm going to pick a character and make them Charlie Brown with the football, right?
Well, one thing I can say from writing Ray McAndrews, I often place Ray in a horrible situation simply so that he can overcome it. And that makes the victory all the sweeter and the catharsis all the greater for the audience.
Yes.
But in overcoming it, we gain strength when we're challenged.
Mm-hmm.
And That's what I'm trying to do there. I want the challenge to be big enough that he just can't wave his hand and it's dealt with.
Yeah.
You know, minor, like, and the other thing that I do with Ray, I actually have the scene in the bar. Yeah, he's hunting the Revenant in that one, and he goes into this dive bar, and there are all these various disincarnates hanging around, waiting for people to come in that they can latch onto, and he describes them as spiritual tapeworms.
Okay. Yeah.
And he goes walking in, and it's like the fast gun going into the saloon in the Old West. The spiritual tapeworms find someplace else to be. And it's basically, yeah, he's thrown down in the big leagues. So these minor players, they're not even going to bother.
Yeah, they know better. Yeah.
They know better. And if they don't, they soon learn.
Well, yeah, and I want to thank you so much for coming out. Of course, Lycanthrope is coming up. Are there any other projects or anything you've got going on that you'd like to plug?
Well, in December, the Arming Freedom, that will be book 5 of the Freedom Saga, will be out. And it's actually a very big turning point. The up until this point, Ray has more or less been reacting. He's been put in situations and hasn't really been empowered to do anything but cope. In Arming Freedom, the ship, the Starhawk, is back on Maroc 5. And what's on Maroc 5? A whole bunch of army surplus left after the blast.
Very nice.
And Ray reaches the point where he says, "I am sick and tired. It seems like everything I encounter is trying to kill me or the woman I love. And it ends now."
Very cool.
Yeah, you got to have that point with the character.
Yeah. So, I tend to end off all of my videos the same way. You're probably going to recognize it, and if you do, feel free to join in. Ladies and gentlemen, merry meet, merry part, merry meet again. Take care, everybody.
Honk and Matt.